generally then, today's session is that core safeguarding training that you will be used to receiving at the start of every academic year, where we take the opportunity to reflect back on some of the core basics around safeguarding and child protection and look in a little bit more detail about what our own procedures are within individual schools for responding to those either little niggles that we get when we suspect something might not be right, or at a more kind of extreme level, if we was to receive some form of direct disclosure from a child or young person, be that in the classroom or more generally around the school community. The session itself is probably going to take between half an hour and 45 minutes as we work through. You'll need to obviously attend the full session, and then after that you'll receive confirmation that you have attended the day. In terms of how the presentation today is built up, we're going to look at a range of different areas. We're going to start by refreshing our understanding of what the four main categories of abuse are, and talking a little bit more detail around female genital mutilation and some of the different kind of approaches to reporting FGM if you were to become aware of it. We're going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on our school communities and start to think about the adverse experiences that young people in our school communities have faced and what some of those different indicators might be that children or young people are really struggling to re-establish themselves back in schools, or that they may have experienced some form of harm during one of the many lockdowns we seem to be having. We're going to touch on child criminal and sexual exploitation and talk about some of the signs to spot in that area. Peer-on-peer abuse and children missing in education. I'm going to look very briefly. You might have heard a lot of people talking about this Ofsted report into sexual abuse in schools, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that and build on how we've addressed the findings of those reports and what we put in place across the trust in that area. And then finally, we're going to just talk about how you listen and respond to a concern, and then also how you would respond to any sort of allegation that you may wish to make around a colleague, or any sort of suspicions or worries more generally around a colleague's well-being, and what kind of support's available in that area. So to start off then, what is safeguarding? Well, safeguarding and child protection are terms that you will have heard before, and you'll have often heard that people will refer to them in the same sentence, or say the safeguarding and child protection lead or the safeguarding and child protection policy. Well, actually, they're two completely different things. Safeguarding is very much the proactive work that we do to keep children safe. It's got a really kind of detailed definition in our main statutory guidance, Keeping Children Safe in Education, which talks about safeguarding being what we do to protect children from maltreatment, to prevent the impairment of their own mental or physical health and development, but also it's about what we do proactively to ensure that children in our care grow up in circumstances that are consistent with the provision of safe and effective care. And that means so much more than just within the home itself, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And I think it's important at this point to note as well that when we're talking about children, whilst that's the phrase that often comes up in the safeguarding world, when we're referring to children in education, we're talking about children meaning everyone up to the age of 18. In terms of child protection then, that is more the reactive side of our work. It is the legal framework and policies that support children who have been harmed or are likely to face significant harm in whatever context that harm's occurred. So the best way to think of it, as I say, is safeguarding is the proactive things we do to keep children safe, and child protection is the framework that tells us what we need to do when something happens to a young person. And it's through those two main kind of areas, really, on those two headings, that we can develop our own safeguarding obligations, both as professionals, but also professionals that work day in, day out in and around school communities. And our three main obligations that we put on staff across our trust are to ensure that we provide a safe environment in which our children can learn. And what we mean by that is that as professionals, we're making sure that we're thinking beyond just the kind of most basic jump to thought around safeguarding, but we're also thinking about the environments that we allow our young people to learn in. So are the classrooms safe? When you're walking down the corridor and you see there's some sort of trip hazard, or you see that there's some sort of disturbance or disorder happening in the corridor, what are you doing to address that, or to raise that, or to bring that to the attention of a leader around school, to ensure that that school community, be that classroom or corridor, is a safe environment? But also further to that as well, it's about how we present ourselves as well. Are we having age-appropriate conversations when we're around children and young people? If we're overhearing colleagues that are talking in a way that we deem to be unprofessional, what are we doing to challenge that? Because again, our school community needs to be that safe environment, and we all have a role to play in ensuring that it is. Secondly, we have an obligation to be prepared to identify children that might benefit from early help. The best way to describe early help is to think back to the old saying of nipping it in the bud. And it's what we can do at the earliest indicator that something might not quite be going right in that child's life. Thinking back to that definition about giving them that opportunity to flourish. If we spot something in a young person that gives us a clue that something might not quite be right in their life, or in their home life, or in their broader kind of school life, what are we doing there to identify that that child might need some more specialist help from our safeguarding leaders in the school? And then finally, it goes without saying that all staff working for the Trust have an obligation to report concerns without delay through the school's procedures. And we're going to touch a little bit on what those procedures are towards the end of the presentation. But as I say, absolutely goes without saying, it is your obligation that if something doesn't seem right, or there is a niggle, or you feel like you might just have a small piece of information relating to a child's safety, that you share that information. So I mentioned earlier around keeping children safe in education, and it's our obligation, as if you're working in a pupil-facing role, you need to read at least part 1 of this document, and at the end I'll show you how you can do that. But if you are a back office based member of staff, that's the best way to describe it, you've got an obligation to read Annex A of that document, and both of them will be provided after. But the document more generally gives us our framework in safeguarding as to what we need to do to keep our young people safe in education, to give them the opportunity to flourish, really. There has been a range of additions and changes to keeping children safe this year from the document you might be more familiar from in September last year. And the main changes really is that the main changes, are really around responding to, as I say, that Ofsted report into sexual abuse, where it's telling us that as staff we need to have this training, we need to understand our different safeguarding obligations, but also we need to be able to pick up on what some of those indicators may be around sexual harm within our schools. In more detail, the guidance basically tells us now from this year that where we suspect that a child may be abused by a peer, that may be subject to some form of sexual harm online, that we as staff have got a duty to reassure the victim, to make sure that we're listening to that young person, we're taking their report seriously, and we're responding to harm that occurs within young people or between young people in the same way that we would have traditionally responded to harm that occurs maybe from an adult or a member of the community or something like that. It's also added this really interesting paragraph, which is on the screen now, which is around that idea of victims. And this for me goes wider than just thinking of victims of peer-on-peer abuse and sexual harm, but victims more generally never been given that impression by the member of staff they're sharing that disclosure with, or the member of staff that's picked up that something might not be right, that they're creating some sort of problem or they're creating some sort of inconvenience by sharing their worries or reporting some form of abuse. It's that final line where it says that nor should a victim ever be made to feel ashamed for making a report, that for me really stands out as a really strong statement in that's changed in this year's guidance. Looking more generally at what's changed then, in terms of what you need to know, as you say, so in terms of keeping children safe, it's always been broken up into 5 main chapters. The first chapter, as I say, is that part 1, which is our pupil-facing staff's obligation to read. And in that, as a change from last year, in case you're thinking you've already read it once before, there's been a number of paragraphs that have changed to kind of more generally help improve the flow of the chapter. But in addition to that, there's been a range of additions around, a lot of additions in one sentence. There has been an addition to that section around sexual harm, sexual violence, and peer-on-peer abuse, and it gives you some more detail around some of the signs and indicators that you can pick up from what's known as corridor culture, so the way young people interact with one another when they're in the school corridor, as an example. Part 2, which is, as I say, around the management of safeguarding, there's a whole new section in there that talks about a whole school approach to safeguarding. You may have heard, and I hope you have heard, terminology like culture of safeguarding or a culture of vigilance. This whole section of this guidance is now given a real focus on that area to reinforce that leaders should develop that whole school safeguarding culture within all settings. And also in there as well, there's a new paragraph for the IT colleagues that have joined us this afternoon, around the importance of online safety training for staff. I know that DSLs within school are pushing out this e-safety training, but I think especially, and we've been taught this by the lockdown and remote learning, that there is a need now for staff to recognise that abuse doesn't just occur in schools and isn't just picked up in the classrooms, but actually when our young people are using technology, they're using computers and iPads and phones in an unmoderated way, that our obligation to identify harmful behaviours still extends beyond the classroom door. In terms of Part 3, safe recruitment, again, there's been just a further kind of readjustment to that section, given a real focus in there around how we should constantly see our recruitment process as a constant element of employment, as opposed to just being when we put a job advert out and bring someone into school, really reinforcing the point that it is about ongoing suitability, making sure that you get those performance management meetings, you get those opportunities to have supervision if you've found yourself in a position reporting a concern and so on. And then finally, or not so finally, there's part 4 and 4A. This is the most significant change to keeping children safe, because it's introduced this whole new section of work around this idea of where, as adults, we need to pick up on any low-level concerns about our colleagues, which sounds in a weird way like we're saying you should be snitching on your colleagues, but it's not. This is about, well, this is really for us at Stowe Valley Multi Academy Trust something we've done all the time with our yellow form system, where the government are now saying to schools that you need to develop systems that allow staff to report into the head teacher any sort of concerns or niggles or worries they may be having around their colleagues' well-being, or the way that their colleagues are kind of presenting themselves or conducting themselves, either in their personal lives or in school. And we touch on that a little bit more towards the end. And then finally, as I say, the sexual violence and sexual harassment section. Whilst it's not a statutory obligation, I would say if you work in a pupil-facing role, especially if you work in a pastoral role, you should have a read through part 5 of this document as well, as it gives us a really clear overview of how we need to respond to peer-on-peer type abuse. So that is keeping children safe in education, the whistle-stop tour of what's changed. In short, quite a bit's changed, but actually a lot of it's just been kind of moved around to make the whole document flow better. But as I say, you need to read the area that's relevant to your role, and you'll get that information after. Okay, so finally in this area then, before we touch on what is abuse itself, it's to remind you that each school has a designated safeguarding lead and at least one deputy designated safeguarding lead. I know the majority of colleagues in the room are from Bilton. The designated safeguarding lead at Bilton School is Gaynor Davey, and the deputy is Tim Chambers. Again, if you are travelling around the trust and you're going into other schools, whilst I appreciate that it's not the first thing on your mind to do when you go in there, is if it's the first time you're visiting, have a look at their school safeguarding policy, learn who their designated safeguarding lead is, so you've got that awareness, for 2 reasons. Firstly, if something crops up that you need to report, you know where to go to. But secondly as well, it's your opportunity to get, when you're travelling around on behalf of the trust into schools, that you can pick out what is that safeguarding culture like, who is the DSL, is it visible within the school who the DSL is, and so forth. Again, all playing our kind of collective role in respect of increasing that culture of safeguarding. Okay, so what is abuse then itself? Well, the next few slides I'm going to go through, we're going to talk in detail around the 4 main categories of abuse, what those categories are, and what some of the signs and indicators are that might give you an indicator that a child's been harmed in that area. I think it's it's important to start by explaining why we only have these 4 categories of abuse. And I think the best way to describe it is that they very much are umbrella terms for child protection. These are, if you're going to place a child into some form of local authority care or onto some sort of statutory support plan with a social worker, it'll be for one of these 4 reasons: because they've been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, or neglected. So, as I say, in these next slides, we're going to go through them in a bit more detail, starting with physical abuse. Physical abuse is defined by being when someone hurts or harms a child or young person on purpose. And this, again, going back to what I said earlier, don't always jump to that conclusion that this is an adult harming a child. It can take place within kind of peer contexts as well. In terms of the signs and indicators of physical abuse, it's one of the, it sounds bad to say, it's almost quite an easy one to pick out when a child has been physically harmed, because whilst bumps and bruises don't always mean that a child is being physically abused, because as we know, all children have accidents, they all trip and fall. Having that kind of inquisitive mindset as professionals working with children to ask children and young people those questions around how they got those injuries, and then sharing what that young person's told you through our CPOM system is a really good way of, again, putting that little piece of information in. Some of the kind of general signs could be unexplained bruising, burns, scald, bite marks, but also as well, physical abuse can go beyond just being kind of hit or harmed, and it could be things like they're being given medicine that they shouldn't be using, and they're being given excessive amounts of food, or on the contrary, very little amounts of food at all. All these different kind of indicators may be a sign that a child is being physically harmed. I think my advice in this area would be if you spot that something's wrong and you are in a pupil-facing role and you feel you've got that relationship to ask that question, ask the question and check the child's all right first, of course. But then once you've had that story, if you will, from that child or young person, immediately popping it onto CPOM so that the DSL gets that information. What is what's a good kind of sign of a safeguarding culture is that where we do identify a child within a school that has, say, a black eye as they're walking around school, that actually the DSL is very quickly inundated with different reports on CPOM saying, I've just seen so-and-so, I've seen Jessica's got a black eye, or I spoke to Jessica this morning in tutor time and she told me that she fell down the stairs. But then a science teacher speaks to her as well and she tells the science teacher that it was an injury playing football. All these little small pieces of the jigsaw, when they go into the DSL, is what supports them in making those decisions around the next step in terms of supporting that child. Turning to sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is defined as when a child or a young person is forced or tricked into sexual activities. And of course, in most cases, they might not understand that what's happening is abuse or that it's wrong. And normally when we deliver training to designated safeguarding leads, we have a bit of an exercise where we ask leaders in the room to start to think about what some of those reasons might be that a child or young person decides that they don't want to report abuse to an adult. And especially when we're looking in this area around sexual abuse, some of the things that always jump out are that idea of, again, that young people not seeing it as wrong, or seeing themselves as being in some sort of relationship, or being kind of what they've seen as a healthy relationship or a healthy sexual relationship, but actually to an adult very quickly has been identified as harmful behaviour. In terms of signs and symptoms, it's really, really difficult to identify sexual abuse. And in the majority of cases, not just around the trust, but nationally, you see that sexual abuse is identified through either third parties, so peers coming forward and saying, like, this is going on, I don't think this is right, or by the adult being caught themselves. But in terms of some of the more kind of wider indicators to think about, if, and this can be young male or female, avoiding wanting to be alone or feeling really frightened by people, if they're suddenly you've seen a real significant shift in their behaviours, they've started displaying signs of self-harm, changing their eating habits or developing some sort of eating problem, can all be signs that a child is themselves battling through some form of sexual abuse. Of course, it could be a range of reasons, but certainly it leads back into this. I think, again, for our pupil-facing roles, in terms of physical signs, the pastoral teams report often that sexual abuse is identified through more young women coming forward and talking or speaking to pastoral leaders about bruising on the genitalia, unexplained bleeding, or soreness in the genitals and anus area, or also developing some sort of sexually transmitted infections or pregnancies that are unexplained. These are all, again, signs that might give you receiving that disclosure, or a pastoral leader working through this scenario, that mindset to start to think outside the box a little bit and to start to think wider than just what's being set in front of you by the young person. Turning to neglect then, neglect is defined as the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical and or psychological needs, especially where it's likely to result in the serious impairment of the child's health or development. And again, I think with neglect, if we were, again, in a room, we'd say, well, give me some examples of what you, how you might spot a child that you felt might be neglected. And quite quickly, people jump to saying that they might be smelly or dirty. The child might report being really hungry or not given enough money for food and so on. In the winter, you might see they've got the complete wrong clothing. They're coming in just their shirt with no coat and so on from there, and more in our kind of early years with our younger children, having kind of untreated nappy rash is something we see a lot in our early years settings, or having kind of again dirty clothes, unchanged, undressed, unwashed and so on. There are all these signs of neglect, but it's also important to remember that neglect means so much more than just financial neglect or poverty in that sense. And actually, on the flip side of that, you can get what's called, I can never say this word, affluent neglect. That's probably not the way to say it, but I can get it out of my mouth. But anyway, so on the other side of that, neglect isn't just about money. So to give you an example of this in real life, which always stuck with me, is I remember going to a conference a few years ago now down towards London, and we sat at a table, and there was a range of different DSLs on the table from city-based schools, but there was one DSL who was on the table from a really posh private school in Kent. And when we were asked to think about a case study around neglect, we of course all gave examples of like this: hungry, not given the right amount of money, not having dinner money, being untidy and so on. And this DSL from this private school said that they recall their worst case of neglect they identified being when one of their children turned up in the classroom with odd socks on, which was very strange because coming from a school in Nottingham where we were surprised, frankly, just to see children in socks, it certainly stood out as a bizarre example. But actually, as the DSL went on to explain the context behind it and the context of their school, that in their school was a niggle that something was unusual, something was changed, something wasn't quite right. And when they explored that, they discovered that the child was living at home with a 15-year-old nanny from Romania. Mum was a travelling doctor and dad was a business person working in New York. And actually, whilst those parents felt they were giving the best education possible at this private school, what they were denying that child of was that basic psychological love, care and affection that they needed. And it was for that reason that actually they themselves, that child, was being neglected. So again, it's thinking about this a bit outside the box, not just jumping to a dirty, smelly child with no money being one that's suffering from neglect. And then finally, we have emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is often forms part of all the other types of abuse that we've discussed there. It can be really difficult to spot the signs of or tell the difference when it comes to emotional harm, because it does sit behind every other type of harm. It's essentially where a child is being constantly or consistently emotionally maltreated. It's sometimes referred to, not as much now, but it has been referred to as psychological abuse. And it can involve a range of different things, from deliberately trying to scare a child or make them feel humiliated or isolated. But it can also be allowing them to be witness to maybe domestic violence in the home, emotional, alcohol or drug misuse in the home. All these different kind of experiences that they get can be emotionally harmful to our children. And also, it is a difficult one to pick up on as well. I think in children, some of the more general signs might be that they're using language that you don't expect them to use, and is often something you see in children that are witness to domestic violence or drug and alcohol misuse. The children are struggling to control their emotions, got extreme outbursts from upset to angry to happy to excitable, all these different emotional outbursts can be a sign as well that they're not getting that stimulation at home. But also on the flip side of that, they can become quite isolated from their friends, their parents, really lack social skills or struggle to make positive friendships. We often find, and I think this goes right to the core of where people talk or used to talk a long time ago around that idea of, oh, well, it's just the way they've been brought up. And actually, I think we've now in the sector got to a point where we've recognised that it's not how children have been brought up, it's those experiences that they had growing up that have led them to have those emotional outbursts, those extreme behaviours and so on. So again, it's about thinking or recognising that behaviour is a form of communication. So what is that child trying to tell you when they're behaving in the way that they are? I'm going to turn to female genital mutilation, which, as always, I say is an area that is distressing to listen about, but alas, it does happen in our communities, it does happen in our countries, and thankfully less and less. But it's important to understand what FGM is and what impact it has on young women. And I think the most important message when you're talking about FGM in a safeguarding context is to recognise that FGM is cultural, it's not religious. When FGM first surfaced as a form of harm, it was seen to be linked back to religion, but it's completely not true at all. In terms of its global prevalence and its history, FGM can be linked back primarily to the Middle East, but more towards African countries, but also some of your kind of Middle Eastern countries around Egypt, Oman, Sudan, and so forth in that area. In terms of what female genital mutilation is, it is a procedure that's carried out on prepubescent girls, which involves either the partial or total removal of the external female genitalia. There are a range of different types of genital mutilation that takes place, but primarily its purpose is to make the genitalia seem unattractive to men and to keep a young girl fresh and pure, as it's seen in their culture. It is only, sadly, quite recently, but it is now illegal in the UK, rightly so, and also planning or preparing on being involved in a conspiracy to allow a child to become subject to FGM is also a criminal offence as well. It's when we work with our attendance teams around the trust, we really kind of talk about FGM in a lot more detail, because it tends to be that we learn about FGM once a young girl has already been subject to that type of harm. You often pick it up in the sense that a child may suddenly disappear for 4 or 5 weeks for an unexplained holiday in some of the countries I just spoke about there. Or it could be that they're returning from the summer holidays and having an extended period of leave after the summer holidays, which actually we then uncover is that young girl recovering themselves at home. But also as well, there has been instances where girls have been found to have FGM as they've been refusing to turn up to their PE lessons, or when they've gone into the PE lessons, they've kind of had that resurgence of trauma in that area as well that's allowed that form of harm to be identified. In terms of how we manage incidents of FGM, it's important you know that it's the one type of safeguarding concern where things differ slightly in terms of how we respond to it. If a staff member becomes concerned that a child a child under the age of 18 has had or is at risk of FGM, the first thing they need to do is notify the designated safeguarding lead. If you as a teacher have somebody come to you and offer a disclosure to you that they have been subject to FGM, it is that member of staff's responsibility, of course with the support of the DSL, to make that call to the police and to make that report to the police. if you suspect or have any worries, or you've got that niggling worry that a child, and this is more aimed towards our pastoral leaders in the room, who are worried that a child might be going out to one of these countries, and it just doesn't sit right, you can't explain, the child's really anxious leading up to it, or there's mention of some of the lesser known terminology linked to FGM, like sooner or tire, or another one which is called Kitan. Any sort of these terminologies coming about, it's really important you share that information with the DSL immediately. I think it's important to remember, whilst they are the broad categories of abuse, the umbrella terms, as I just said, that actually safeguarding or safeguarding concerns, there isn't one set tag about what is or what isn't a concern. A concern is when you become worried about a child, or that your vigilance leads to you making some form of observation that something isn't quite right in that child's life, and then doing something about it. In terms of concerns and safeguarding them, we know that many of our young people in our schools don't grow up in a warm, nurturing or loving environment, and we know that they face traumatic and challenging events in their life. And we know as well that there is a clear correlation between adverse child experiences, as I was just mentioning, and lifelong challenges that come as a result of that, which can affect everything from health to well-being, and can and do contribute to an increased likelihood of risk-taking behaviours in their teenage years. So what happened is that as we started to make that link, there was a study around addressing adversity and recognising childhood experiences, and this model called the ACEs model, the Adverse Child Experiences Model, taught us some basic principles about what adverse child experiences are and how they have an impact on later life. In terms of adverse child experiences, then they were put into these 8 kind of categories, really, that if a young person in their life as they grow up experience a number of these different things, they're more likely to go on in life to experience health issues, mental health issues, well-being issues, and less likely to flourish in the way that we'd like them to. And if you just look at those categories then, so we've got maltreatment, we've got violence, we've got adjustment, prejudice, family adversity, inhumane treatment, bereavement and survivorship and adult responsibilities. How many of those can we actually link back to the COVID-19 experiences that our young people have had? Adjustment, school shut. Prejudice, some of our young people who are from an Asian background have experienced prejudice and bullying towards them as people jump to conclusions around the origin of the virus. Family adversity, they've suddenly lived at home watching parents work where they've heard parents talk about furlough, redundancy, lack of money, financial struggles. Adult responsibilities. A lot of our young people came back from lockdowns and reported about how all of a sudden, because mum and dad were working from home, they were making lunch for everyone, or they were the ones that would have to look after younger siblings or deliver teaching to younger siblings because mum and dad were at work. And then everyone's experienced some type of survivorship. The nature of the pandemic is a health crisis. So our young people who are growing up and are already acutely aware of what is going on in the world through their social media channels that are often unmoderated, they all develop a sense of survivorship. They have or haven't had the virus. They may know people that have been bereaved as a result of the virus. So again, whilst I'm not trying to link all this back to COVID, it's important to remember that when you hear school leaders and when you hear the wider sector talk about the need to adjust the way we do schooling or the way we do education as a result of COVID, we've got to recognise that our young people haven't just had additional holidays, but they have experienced adversity in their childhood. Stressful situations cause our children to worry, and we know that even if they don't show it. I think the best advice we can really give now at this point about COVID, in recognition of 2 things. Firstly, we feel like, certainly the public image of COVID seems to feel like we're coming the right way out of it. But also we are, I would imagine, approaching a point where winter comes back in and there is going to be more conversations around COVID. It's important that we talk to our children and young people about COVID. We make sure that the messages and the news they hear about the virus is accurate. As I said a moment ago, to reiterate the point, we know our young people use social media and at times use not necessarily mainstream social media to get their news and information about the world. So not being afraid to have those open conversations about the coronavirus and about lockdowns and so on is a really kind of positive approach we can take there. Whilst I'm giving you very much an over the top a top-down view of that, really, you can go away and read a little bit more about that if you so wish, and I'll make sure there's a link in that's sent out to you after if you want to explore that. So what is some of the biggest issues in our secondary schools in trust then? Well, we can look towards child criminal and sexual exploitation. If you think about geographically where the trust schools are located in terms of rural towns, on main train lines, Midlands based, very much conurbation, another word I can't say, not too far away from cities basically. All these are geographical indicators that our young people are more likely to be at risk of child sexual and criminal exploitation. So I just want to tell you briefly about what those two areas are and what people mean when they're talking about CSE and CCE. Starting with child sexual exploitation then. Well, CSE occurs in a very similar way to sexual abuse, where there's an imbalance of power either to coerce or manipulate or deceive a child into sexual activity in exchange for something else, for financial status or for some sort of statal advantage in a gang or something like that. The difference between CSE and child criminal exploitation is becoming less and less, as we're seeing that child sexual exploitation is becoming a form or an indicator of child criminal exploitation. And what I mean by that is that whereas traditionally, or historically is probably the better way to put it, young girls have been subject to CSE through long-term grooming, through kind of being given gifts, being given money, meals out and so on. And child criminal exploitation has been very much about running drugs around, drug dealing. We've now seen them start to interlink as we start to see more gangs emerging, more gangs that are formed through online, and where actually young girls are being seen very much as passed around amongst the gangs. The biggest indicator we've seen in Bilton, to be quite honest with you, is young girls carrying car keys, which is a sign of where an elder person within the gang has given them their spare car key, almost as a sign of ownership, if you will. It makes the young girl feel like she's got some responsibility. She's got the car key, and actually for that for the elder male that's given her the car key, there's no real kind of benefit to him for her having it, but actually it's his sign of her owning it. She's got his car key. So again, just something to pick out from there. In terms of wider signs and indicators of both forms of exploitation, where young people have unexplained money, clothes, phones, especially where there's a lot of money in there, where they're carrying weapons. Of course, our behaviour and our pastoral teams are acutely aware of the need to consider criminal exploitation if they involve themselves in cases of young people carrying knives or other type of homemade weapons. Involvement with older people. Are you walking down that corridor and you hear a pupil talking about relationships with older males or females in and around the school community or the wider community? Are children and young people experiencing self-harm, poor mental health, wearing of colours, wearing different jumpers, bandanas, all these different signs that sound very unrealistic on the face of it, but do happen within our schools, and it's certainly something to be aware of. And then finally in this area, it's important to remember that both child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation is a form of abuse. Okay, firing through them, we probably got about 15-20 minutes left, and is to look at sexual violence, harassment and online abuse. So firstly, just to tell you a little bit about what peer-on-peer abuse is, and we've very much kind of touched on this throughout, really, is that idea of children being capable to abuse each other, and that when we're talking about child abuse, we're not solely thinking of an adult perpetrator. Peer-on-peer abuse can come in a range of different forms, from bullying all the way through to causing one another physical harm, intimidating, some sort of kind of initiation rituals with violence, upskirting, where people will take photos, literally as described, up young girls' skirts as they're walking up the staircase, and then that's then used to exploit that young girl or through some form of extortion. And then also as well, cyberbullying, where our young people are experiencing harm from peers on sites like your Instagram, your TikToks, and so on and so forth, where our young people are experiencing non-stop bullying, frankly. And there was a really, I can't remember who said it, but there was a really important quote in the safeguarding world where someone said that actually, whereas 20 years ago bullying stopped at the school gates, for our young people now, bullying never stops, because actually it happens in school, then they go home, sit on the bed, and their phone opens, and it continues, because their life is 24/7, and actually they've got a range of different contexts and spheres of influence that they associate themselves in, and actually all those different contexts carry their own different type of harm, and we need to be aware of that. So when we talk about safeguarding not stopping at the school gates, that's exactly why. So let me tell you a little bit about this Ofsted review then that you may have heard about. So, and if I can, I want to start by taking you back to March 2021. We'd just come out of the second or third, which Boris Johnson will say it was the second, but it was probably the fourth lockdown that we had, and we're starting to introduce or reintroduce children and young people back into schools. And it was that same time really where this national conversation started to come about, where young women were speaking out about their experiences of sexual abuse in not just schools but in the broader education sector, university, further education, and so on. And it was as a result of that conversation that the Everyone's Invited movement came about. It was a website developed by a lady called Sienna. Apologies, I can't remember her full name, but she created this movement to give young women that space to be able to come forward and talk about their experiences of sexual abuse. And since its inception, there's been over 50,000 testimonials, which covers about 25% of all education settings within the school have been mentioned. Within our region, 1 in 3 schools have been mentioned. In our trust, some schools have been mentioned. It is something that has hit every education setting and given schools a bit of a wake-up call, frankly. And it was as a result of the sector having that wake-up call that the Department for Education commissioned Ofsted to undertake a review into the prevalence of sexual abuse within schools. And they did exactly that. Some may know they visited Bilton School as part of that visit, and we were more than happy to support their visit. They visited around 50 schools, picked at random from different regions. Some were mentioned on the websites, others weren't. It was a really insightful visit, but there we go. They were looking essentially at 4 key questions. The government wanted to know whether or not there was sufficient guidance for how schools deal with sexual violence, whether the relationship between schools and referrals into the police works. They wanted to know whether Ofsted inspections looked correctly at this issue in the right way. And they wanted to know if schools were appropriately delivering the RSHE curriculum. Whilst there's on that, and you can see it in a bit more detail when you get the slide yourself if you so wish, there's a range of answers there. Generally, yes, there was guidance. Generally, it was difficult for DSLs to make decisions when police investigations were ongoing. Yes and no, some inspectors did look at information about peer-on-peer abuse, others didn't in inspections. And it told us what we know, and the teacher in the room will nod, is that those that are non-specialists in RSHE struggle with the confidence to deliver RSHE lessons, and at times then that would mean the content being delivered to young people isn't consistent with the pupil experience of peer-on-peer abuse, as we just mentioned there in terms of social media and so on. But more relevant to you and now and this is some of the key quotes that came out of that report. Ofsted said that sexual abuse in schools is worse than most adults thought. They said that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse is so common that young people don't report it. young people say it happens so often that they just accept that's what happens, and it's not for them to report it. It's just normal. They found that girls in particular are regularly sent explicit images from boys, and in the majority of occasions they were unsolicited. In the follow-up student groups that we've done, not just in our trust but in partnership with a range of other schools around the region, is that what we're seeing in terms of data come out of these conversations with young people in schools across the region is that girls are saying that yes, they will often receive unsolicited indecent images from boys, but also boys will receive unsolicited indecent images of other girls shared to them without being asking. There's a real challenge for schools to address and shift this culture. And it just goes in there as well. And this is a message that's come out in pretty much every school that's spoken about this topic, is that young people thought it was acceptable and do think it's acceptable to ask someone for a nude image, but almost feel that the line is crossed when that image is shared on further. So again, it just reinforces that need to shift that approach, really. And then finally, I thought this was something we probably could all relate to in terms of what we've seen around any school building in the country we've ever been to, is that how often boys talk about jokes, compliments, banter when they're saying something to a girl, whereas the girls will describe it as routine name calling, sexualized comments and objectification, and how that perception between boys and girls when it comes to that corridor culture entirely shifts. So what is it that, what part do we have in terms of what can we do to help and play our part in this, really? And it goes back to this key point, which is an approach that all of our schools in the trust have adopted, which is to say that even without specific information, we're going to act on the assumption that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse is a problem in all of our schools. And we're doing that because actually, as we just said a moment ago, sexual harassment and online abuse is so common, children aren't reporting it. So we know we haven't got the data. Our children think it's acceptable to ask for a nude image. If they think it's acceptable, they're not going to report it. And it's for that reason that you'll see an increased presence around the conversation of saying, this is not okay. Our schools having a zero tolerance approach to sexual violence and sexual harassment. And when you're walking around our school corridors, if you see a bra strap being pinged, if you hear a girl being called a slag or a boy being called gay, ask yourself the question, what are you doing? Are you walking past it? Or are you challenging it? Or if you're not confident to challenge it, are you observing that situation well enough to be able to report it back to a leader in detail so that it can be addressed properly? Again, going back to our core safeguard obligation about identifying opportunities to provide early help. Whilst a lot of the time concerns are picked up through observations, there are times when a child will make a direct disclosure to you. Interestingly, when we've looked at data across, I can't remember where it was, it wasn't just our trust, but it was a big piece of data set which was about who young people made direct disclosures to, so not just observations, but when they come forward and say, this has happened to me. Actually, the lowest group of staff that report was made to was teachers. The highest group of staff were the school reception staff, the pastoral leaders, the school nurse, the teachers and the staff that are seen by the pupils regularly in a supportive way. And the reason I tell you that is because actually it's important to remember that disclosures, just because you work in the front office or the finance office or the IT office, it doesn't mean a child might not just see you as a safe adult, a consistent person they see around school, but someone who isn't involved in their tutor times or the year group, or someone where they don't make the link between the authority of a senior leader. They make that link, you're an adult that work in a school, and they ask to speak to you. It does happen. And if it does, it's important that you just listen. It is not your role to investigate, to stop them, to kind of go away and confront the alleged abuser. It's your obligation just to listen. What I always say in terms of the broader do's and don'ts is that from a very young age now, children are told and understand what confidentiality means. One of the worst things you can do if a child's making a disclosure to you is say, oh, let me just stop you before you say anything else. can I just remind you that confidentiality, I'm going to have to tell someone else, if whatever you tell, that all that does is put a barrier in the way of that young person. If a child or a young person is making a disclosure to you, they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they've built the confidence that you're going to do something about it. And that in telling you, they know you're going to have to do something about it. And whilst it might not be what they think they want, deep down, the reason they're telling you is because they expect you to do something about it. So what can you do? Be accessible, be receptive, listen carefully, take them serious. Go back to what we said right at the beginning about that change in keeping children safe. Make that victim feel like you are going to do something about this. You are taking them seriously. You are not putting the blame at their door. Make a clear record about what was said. Make a really clear, accurate record that goes on CPOM straight away. But then also seek some support for yourself as well. We all come to work. We don't expect to hear some of the trauma that our young people and children face. So when you're told about that so directly, go away and feel confident to speak to the DSL and to have that opportunity to offload yourself. In terms of what not to do, don't ask leading questions. Don't tell the child you're going to keep this a secret. Don't speculate or accuse anyone. Don't tell them to stop talking or stop that person from speaking freely. Just allow that conversation to flow, make an accurate record, and then immediately report that concern to the DSL using CPOMs. What happens after you've made that report then? And this is a question that often is asked, really, is about what happens next. I put the concern, I don't really know what's going on next. Well, this is what you can expect to happen. Once you make that raise that concern and you add it to CPOMs, it's going to be screened by a DSL. The luxury of CPOMs means that it will alert the right people at the right time to have a look at that concern and to make some decisions about what's going to happen next. And the DSL essentially going to do one of three things. They're going to monitor it, they're going to keep an eye on it, they're going to discuss it with the young person or maybe with another DSL or maybe with the parent, or they're going to make a referral themselves into social care. Once the action's taken, you should then expect to get some feedback. You're not going to get the detailed feedback that you might want around what action's been taken, but you should expect from a DSL, if you don't get it, go and ask for it, some feedback that gives you enough assurance that the child or appropriate action's been taken to keep the child safe. In terms of referrals to social care then, at times the DSL will make a referral into social care if it's believed that the child is suffering or is likely to suffer or might be at risk of suffering some form of harm. In most cases, the parents will be told that referral is going to be made. However, if telling that parent you're going to make that referral is going to make things worse, then they wouldn't make those parents aware and they would lead that to social services. But it's important to remember, and that's why this slide's in here really, is that whilst in most cases the DSL will make that referral, actually what you need to know is that anyone can make a referral into social care. You also need to be aware as well that there may be a time where you might feel the need to escalate a concern internally or externally. This might be because you're not happy with the action that's been taken. You found it really difficult to get hold of a DSL. You're not satisfied with the decision that's been taken, or you don't feel like that the concern's even been addressed. Our safeguarding policies, both at school level and trust level, is really clear that we should never let a concern sit there unaction. It should always have an outcome to it. So if you feel like something's not happened as you'd like it to, then you need to make a report. If you are concerned, and when I say make a report, you, in the first instance, speak to the head teacher or reach out to myself at the trust, or from January, Sam Godfrey at the trust, and her details will be circulated as well. So what do we do? We've spoken a lot about being concerned about young people and children, but what do we do if we have a concern about one of our colleagues or an adult that's on our school site? Well, as I say, all concerns about adults should be raised using a yellow form, which is the consistent form of reporting across the trust, and that yellow form should be given to the head teacher. Those forms should be available both at reception, in the staff room, but also from the head teacher themselves. Again, don't let the fact you might not be able to find a form stop you from doing one. And if any head teacher ever gives you grief for going and asking them for a yellow form, you should be raising that up to the trust as well, so that challenge can be made. Because again, our culture around safeguarding stretches so much further than just sharing a worry about a child. And as I was talking earlier about that idea of low-level concerns, where we're worried that one of our colleagues may be their well-being might be starting to have an impact on the way they're presenting around school, their conduct around young people is potentially dangerous or unsuitable or unprofessional, that we address that as well. There will be times where we, as an organisation, get some information about an adult that would indicate they've done one of these 4 things. This is called the LADO harm test. I'll give you a moment to read those through. But the LADO is what's known as the local authority's designated officer. They are the person within the local authority whose sole job is to oversee and to coordinate our trust response or school response to an allegation about an adult where the information suggests that they may have harmed a child, that they possibly committed a criminal offence against a child, behaved towards a child that indicates they're not suitable to work with them, or that they may pose a risk of harm to children. That is the more kind of extreme end of allegations. The majority of allegations are dealt with by school leaders through speaking to adults and making sure that support is put in place as well for the adults as well. But the main message in that really for you is if you've got a niggle, something doesn't sit right with you about one of your colleagues, make sure you share that information immediately. Of course, if you're not happy or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, there are whistleblowing options. Again, in these slides, you'll have the details for the local authority's designated officer. But of course, externally, you can always reach out to the NSPCC as well. Okay, with 2 minutes to go, I will finally just draw your attention to the documents that you must read. As I say, Keeping Children Safe in Education, September 2021, Part 1, needs to be read by all pupil-facing staff. Keeping Children Safe in Education, September 2021, Annex A, needs to be read by staff that are not in a pupil-facing role. Essentially, it's just a slimmed-down version of Part 1. You need to read and understand the School Child Protection Policy. You need to read and understand our Trust Safeguarding Policy, our Code of Conduct, and our Behaviour Policy. One thing we've done this year in recognition that actually it is not everyone has the time to read the document is that we've also created an audiobook version of Keeping Children Safe. So if you've not already sick enough of my voice after an hour, you can go on to Spotify or Apple Music, search for Safeguarding Days and have a listen to the audiobook as well, where essentially it's just read out word for word. It's just a different way of getting that same information. In your email, which will say thanks for listening, you'll get this, which is your Safeguard INSET Return form. If you work for the Trust Central team, that will need to be sent to Sam Godfrey and myself, and between we'll keep hold of them. If it's within school, it needs to go to your designated safeguarding lead, who will keep a record of those documents. So there we are. I hope that has been a good refreshing, if you will, of your safeguarding knowledge. If you do have any more specific questions that come about when you reflect on the training, please do reach out, drop me an email, catch me in and around school, and we'll be able to go from there. So thanks very much for your time, and I wish you a good afternoon.